Graham and I hope everyone's having a great day, and welcome to today's video. Now this is part 3 in the video tutorial series where we're looking at the Panasonic Lumix bridge camera range. In today's video I'm going to look at exposure and how the camera calculates the exposure, what settings you've got in there to influence the way the camera does make that metering choice, and how it can be fooled and how you can correct it to make sure you've got perfect exposure either for stills or for video. So today I've got the Panasonic Lumix FZ1000 Mark II out. I've got my book out for this now. It's been out for about 3 or 4 months. It's available on my website. I'll put a link to that in the video description below. Or if you're fairly affluent, you can buy it from the Amazon websites across the world. So it's out there if you want to have a look at the FZ1000 Mark II user manual. Enough of the adverts, let's get on with today's program. So we're going to look at exposure and how the camera can calculate exposure. Now the whole purpose of the camera metering circuit is to make sure that all the midtones are correctly exposed and give us a digital value of about 127 if we were to look at that in a Photoshop, for example, and we use the eyedropper to measure the luminosity of that part of the image. So traditionally you would use the meter in the whole area mode or the center weighted mode to enable you to capture the right exposure. Green grass is a good mid-tone. You can use, of course, grey cards to give you a more accurate exposure, and these are designed to give an 18% reflectance, which is midway between the highlights at 255 and the shadows at 0. So this should give you a reading of 127 for perfect exposure. So if you were to take a picture of this and the camera was exposing correctly, if you were to look at that in Photoshop, you'd see its value was about 127. So if you've got a tricky lighting situation where you're against the light or you've got a non-standard scene, you could actually use your grey card to take an exposure reading and then take your shot. So put that into the manual mode and take the shot. I said grass has got a reflectance of about 18%, so that's a good standby if you're out and about and you are stuck with a tricky lighting situation. You can actually meter off the grass, set that then as a manual exposure and take your shot and you'll get a perfect exposure. I'm going to demonstrate both of those methods now. So I'll put the grey card in the same light and I'll get an exposure reading. So I'm going to fill the whole area with the grey card, and it's giving me an exposure of 1/800th at f5 ISO 125. So I'll set that in the manual mode. So I'm going to set a shutter speed of 1/800th at f5 and ISO 125. So I'll take that picture in the same light. So that's 1/800th f5 ISO 125, and you'll see on screen it's a perfect exposure. The other method you can use is to use the palm of your hand, and I think this works across all ethnicities too. So if you've got dark hands, then if you use a palm of your hand, I believe this still works for you. So if I take a meter reading off the palm of my hand again in this sunlight, if again fill in the screen, again I'm getting exposure of 1/800th. Oh sorry, I'm in the manual mode, let me go back to aperture priority. I'm getting an exposure reading of a 6/40th at f5, so we're within 1/3 of a stop, so that would be easily corrected in your after processing. So the 3 metering modes that the camera can use are the whole area, the center weighted and spot. Now the spot is an ideal method if you've got something which has got very high contrast against the background. The moon's a very good example of where spot metering is ideal. You can use the spot to meter from a crater on the moon, which is mid-tone grey, and you'll get a perfect exposure. If you use a whole area or center weighted, there's so much darkness in the sky there that the meter's going to be fooled into thinking that that needs to be brought to mid-grey as well, and it will give you a very overexposed image and you get the white orb rather than the moon with all the detail in it. So which metering mode should you use and when? Well, whole area is good because it evaluates the whole of the scene, tries to work out the contrast ratio between your foreground and background and set an exposure dependent on that. If you're taking portraits, it's better to use sort of center weighted because your subject is normally going to be in the middle of the scene, so it will concentrate on getting the subject right. and spot is where you want precise metering from either a distant object or one that's got a lot of gradation across it and you want to take a specific point. Now, it's quite possible you get a lighting situation which can fool the meter. If you've got a subject, for example, if you're taking a portrait in snow, then you'll find that the whiteness of the scene fools the meter into thinking that the scene is actually overexposed, and it darkens the image and it makes you have a very much underexposed image. You get these greyish looking backgrounds rather than a pure white background. And the same applies to beach scenes as well. Bright white sand can give you a lot of underexposure, and then we use what's called exposure compensation. An EV is accessed in different ways on these cameras, normally through the push of a button or on the cursor control, depends which camera you're using, but exposure compensation allows you to correct when the meter has got it wrong. So for example, on this camera, the exposure compensation is here on the function 4 button. So when you push that, it brings up the EV scale and you can adjust the exposure. This is of course in the semi-automatic modes. If you're in the manual mode, then you don't have exposure compensation. You determine that by setting your exposure. So if you want underexposure, you either use a faster shutter speed or a smaller aperture. That's the way you work it in manual mode. On screen now you can see some examples of when I've actually forced the camera to make the wrong decision. So I set the subject up against the neutral grey background and the exposure is absolutely correct. But when I substitute that grey background for a white background, you notice the subject becomes underexposed. So the camera's underexposed that because of that white background. It's influenced the way the meters worked. If I substitute the white background for a black background, you get the converse. So the black background is influencing the meter and it overexposes the image, so you get a much bleached out look. So this is when you should actually remember to use your exposure compensation. So this is where you use exposure compensation again. So with that same image where it was overexposed because of the black background, I dial in negative EV, so minus exposure compensation, to bring the subject back to the normal balance. And it's the same with snow. You always want to plus EV when you're shooting on snow to brighten up the background because the camera's been influenced by the amount of whiteness in the scene. Now there is an in-camera tool you can use, it's called the histogram, and the histogram is just a visual representation of the tones between the shadows, which are at 0 digital value, to the highlights were at digital value 255, so the whole of your scene should fall within that range. If you've got it perfect, then you'll notice your midtones sit on the 127 axis, so you've got everything perfectly balanced. The best way to do this is to actually take your scene and then review the image rather than look at the live view of the histogram, because that's not influenced by the exposure. So take your picture, have a look at the histogram, and if it's perfectly centered, then you know you've got a good exposure. Now there is a group of enthusiasts that shoot with what's called exposed to the right. So this means that they're trying to force the highlights to the right hand side of that graph, but without pushing them into overexposure. The theory is being that the blacks in your image are brought above the noise level. In digital photography, we've always got a noise floor, which might be in the shadow area of your image. So if we move everything to the right, it means that those darkest blacks might be above the noise level. So when you process that image and bring the midtones back to the midtone position, you'll find that your blacks are clear without noise. There's some benefit in it, but it's a lot of messing around, and sometimes you will overexpose if you're not careful. So it's better to try and keep your exposure centered and make sure you've got it right. So if you see that image on screen, you'll see that the midtone peak is exactly on the 127 axis. So we've got our highlights, which are contained within the 255 boundary. Our shadows don't fall down to 0. And if you look at the individual color channels, the red, the green and the blue, again, none of them are into the shadow area or into the highlight area. So that shows we've got good exposure. Even though we've got those bright white clouds in the scene, they've not been overexposed. So the histogram, when you review it in the replay mode, gives you a good idea of how that subject has been captured. There are of course situations where you need to do a bit of interpretation. So if you shot an image on snow, then there are going to be a lot of white peaks in there, or conversely if you're taking a picture in shadows, there'll be a lot of black peaks. So you've got to use a bit of interpretation when it comes to images which are outside the normal range of exposures. If you want a tip here, if you put the image review mode into the hold position, then when you take a picture, that image will stay in your viewfinder or on your LCD, and if you use the display button, you can actually cycle through until you find the histogram there, and then you get an immediate view of how that image has been captured. And so you can see if your neutral greys are neutral, or if you're overexposing, you'll see that immediately you've taken the picture. Just press the shutter button then to clear that preview, and you can go on to shoot your next image. To finish this video off, I've got some images here that I've just shot this morning as I walked around Revens Village. Some which are backlit, some which are frontlit, and I've had to vary the exposure in a couple of the backlit shots to overcome the amount of dynamic range that would need to be captured in the subject. In one shot there of the flower, which is severely backlit, it's beyond the dynamic range at which this camera can capture, so there's more than 9 or 10 stops of dynamic range there. So to ensure that I've got enough detail in the shadows as well as retaining the highlights in the petal from the backlight, I've used flash to fill that in, and that's reduced the dynamic range. So instead of having to try and accommodate 10 or 12 stops of light, it's now having to only compensate for sort of 6 or 7 because I've filled the shadows with that flash. So you can either use a white reflector or a silver reflector to bounce some light back into your shadows if you're shooting in these extreme light conditions where you are not going to have enough dynamic range with these cameras to be able to capture the scene. You can try the IHDR mode of the camera. That will artificially increase the shadows to try and resolve that dynamic range. Here's a shot using the standard mode versus IHDR, and you see the camera has brightened the shadows in the image of the stocks here. Well, that's it for today's video on the subject of exposure, how the camera calculates exposure, how you can use a neutral grey card to give you a correct exposure in very tricky lighting situations, how you can overcome scene types which are going to fool the camera by using exposure compensation, and some of the tricks of using the histogram to be able to evaluate your image that's been captured as to whether you've got enough range there to enable you to process the shadows and the highlights. My next video we're going to be looking at the autofocus and manual focus modes. They were going to be included in today's video, but it would make this whole video far too long to assimilate. So the next video will be on the AF and manual focus modes of this range of cameras. So until then, thanks very much for watching, and of course if you are a new viewer, please do click that subscribe button and the bell notification icon to be advised when I do upload that new video. If you've not seen my photo effect blog, I'll put a link to that also in the video description below. You can check out that blog. There's lots more information on Panasonic Lumix bridge cameras, and there's the application to join my monthly newsletter group, which now goes out to 4,000 people. So if you want to join that group, just fill in the application form, which gives me the authority to send you emails. So as usual, thanks very much for watching. Please do take care, and I hope to see you all in the next one. Goodbye for now.